Well, comrades, I think as René said in his opening remarks, apart from many issues, we are of course celebrating this year 50 years since the foundation of the Committee for a Workers' International. That has been 5 decades of great achievements, of intervention in the class struggle, in the case of Liverpool and the poll tax, of leading big sections of the class struggle in Britain at that particular time. It has also involved, comrades, of course, a struggle over 5 decades of defending the principles of Marxism. It has involved a struggle, of course, to defend the principles of Marxism and to face up to critical changes in the world situation which took place during those 5 decades. And partly inevitably, that involved internal discussion and debate to clarify the issues, to face up to decisive changes in the world situation which have taken place in the course of the last 5 decades. But now we have, as far as the Committee for a Workers' International, 50 years since our foundations, to face up to new challenges, to new tasks, and to new opportunities which confront the working class and a new era of capitalism which we are now in. Perspectives for us as a Committee for a Workers' International is not to work out a blueprint of this or that development. It is to develop the broad trends to prepare us, to prepare the working class for the main developments which will take place, but is a working hypothesis to take into account crucial changes that may occur at each particular period. And it is a crucial task of this school, of the Committee for a Workers' International, to ensure that we grasp that we're in an entirely new era of global capitalism. It is an era that is marked already by turmoil, convulsions, instability, uncertainty, and massive polarization. One aspect of the polarization is the chasm which has opened up between the rich and the poor globally, which is unprecedented in the history of capitalism. Just to give one example, the recent report by Oxfam pointed out that in 2020, 5 billion people on this planet became poorer. At the same time, the 5 richest men doubled their fortunes at the rate of $14 million per hour. It's staggering. At that level of polarization is one of the critical factors driving the explosive situation of the class struggle which has begun to erupt in different countries and on different continents. But this era of convulsions also means, comrades, that all of the old certainties have been broken, and it befalls us as Marxists to apply afresh the method of Marxism to a new world situation. We should remember what Lenin often mentioned and referred to, that it is not sufficient to repeat old formulas which do not correspond to a new historic situation and changes in the world situation. We cannot prepare ourselves for the era that we are now in if we viewed the world situation through the prism of what existed before the crisis in 2008 and what existed pre-pandemic. The crucial historic changes which are in the process of taking place mean that what in the past period seemed impossible becomes possible, what seemed implausible becomes plausible. But the dystopian era of capitalism that we are now in objectively means the objective possibilities and necessity for socialism are greater than they've ever been. Their realization, however, up until this point has been held back and prevented by subjective weaknesses, the lack of organization and leadership of the working class, and the level of political consciousness which exists globally. And it means, comrades, we're now in an era of a protracted death agony of capitalism. A system which, as Marx explained, came onto the historical stage dripping in blood. And what current events are already illustrating is that it will leave the historical stage in the same manner. Events are taking place globally. It is impossible for us to develop any perspective nationally without taking into account the world situation. Capitalism, comrades, is in a dead end and a blind alley on all fronts. Economically, geopolitically, socially, and environmentally. The world economy, despite the claims of the bourgeois economists that they're looking for a soft landing, in reality, globally has been stagnant. Where it's been some growth, it's been of an extremely feeble character, which has brought relatively little or no gains as far as the mass of the working class is concerned. It's been possible in the last couple of years for capitalism to avoid a major crash. Part of that, comrades, not all of it, but part of it is probably due to the massive explosion which has taken place of military expenditure worldwide. It's increased to a staggering level, reaching $2.5 trillion at this stage. And by the way, to make a point here, although we say the massive increase in military expenditure has been a factor which has allowed them to avoid a crash, we need to emphasize one point. That does not mean to say we're raising the point of view as was raised in the 1970s by the Cliffites, by the Socialist Workers' Party leadership, of their ideas of the permanent arms economy, which by a growth of military expenditure will allow capitalism to avoid entering a crisis. That's not the perspective or the reality of the situation. All of the underlying problems in the world economy that we identified previously in our discussions and our documents continue to exist. You have massive global debt, which is a major feature of the world situation, affecting in particular the two most powerful economies on the planet, US imperialism and China as well. Both are riddled by massive debt burdens. The issue of inflation has not been resolved. May have brought it down a little bit in some countries, but it's not fundamentally been eliminated from the system, and nor can it be. The return to the multipolar world means that we have seen a dramatic increase of protectionism, even under the Biden administration. The underlying crisis in the financial system is such that a new financial crash and crisis is possible to break at any conjuncture. And while they boast about the low levels of unemployment in many countries, particularly the US, the reality is, what is the character of the employment which exists? It is fundamentally a precariat layer of the working class on low wages, where the perception is, despite claims of growth, there is no feeling amongst the mass of the working population that living standards have grown or risen, or there's a prospect of that happening. And apart from the critical developments in the Western imperialist powers, we have to emphasize here the crisis which is unfolding in China. The recent plenum was really a damp squib, is marked by a dramatic slowdown in the Chinese economy, of a growth rate officially below 5%, which is wholly insufficient to deal with the rocketing levels of youth unemployment which affect China. Xi is trying to develop the economy. Xi is trying to develop the economy so it becomes a little bit less dependent on the export boom which it did in the past by developing what he calls high quality growth, technology-driven sectors of the economy. What the Chinese regime dubbed as the new productive forces, the new three, electronic vehicles, batteries and solar panels. They're hoping globally they'll be able to transform their economic position in the future from being one of imitating what happens in the West fundamentally as far as high technology is concerned to surpassing it. That's the strategy that they're adopting. How far they go with that is another question, because of the internal problems they have in terms of the absence of the market and, of course, the developments that are taking place on the global economy as well. But a critical factor, comrades, we have to incorporate in our discussions on the world economy and the world political situation is the environmental catastrophe which is accelerating and developing at this stage. Apart from anything else, it is having a crippling effect on food production. The issue of global famine is becoming a major issue and is going to be a dominant issue in big sections of the neo-colonial world now and in the coming years. And what is becoming evident is, of course, the impossibility of resolving the issue of the climate catastrophe within the confines of capitalism. And by the way, the hypocrisy of the West, trying to blame it all on the neo-colonial world in terms of, if you take the recent reports, they point out that the 5 largest imperial powers on the planet are now responsible for 67% of new carbon emissions. And the incapacity of capitalism to be able to resolve this crisis is inevitably going to impact and is impacting on sections of the consciousness of the youth in particular involved in the environmental movement, which will increasingly begin to question the system. Others, of course, from the petty bourgeois layer, will adapt to the system itself. Now, it's impossible, comrades, in a session like this to go into depth in any of these issues, but there's many other factors. The leaps that have taken place in artificial intelligence in the recent period are going to impact economically, socially, maybe not immediately, it may take time, but that all of these issues need to be factored in to the developing crisis, the unfolding crisis in terms of the global capitalist economy. When we speak of crisis, it just does not mean we're talking about we're not discussing, of course, about an ultimate one crisis of capitalism. We're talking of a series of crises within which you're bound to have some growth or upturn in different sections of the economy, but it's an assessment of the broad historical era the capitalist economic system is now in. But if we're discussing world perspectives today, comrades, of course the global situation is dominated by the geopolitical clashes and conflicts which are taking place. Whole new realignments are in the process of unfolding. How exactly they will develop is not fully clear, but nevertheless there are important marked trends which are emerging in the world situation. The recent NATO summit was a certain turning point, crystallizing these processes. It was more bellicose from the point of view of Western imperialism. China was denounced more demonstratively as being the great enabler, enabling Putin to sustain the war in the Ukraine. The fact that Britain and some other countries have authorized the use of missiles to attack Russia itself, not just the Ukraine, represents a change in the situation, as does the deployment of US missiles in Germany. We've had the statements from the German defense minister, I think it was, about the necessity of being prepared for war, or preparing for war at a certain stage. That's now been echoed last week by the new Chief of Staff of the British Armed Forces, who went a bit further and said that Britain needs to prepare for war in 3 years. And yet, despite the bellicose nature of the Western powers, there's also important divisions existing amongst them, forced by the geopolitical conflicts which are taking place. And in Europe in particular, they're terrified of the consequences of a Trump victory for what effect that will have in terms of European-US relations. But that is on the one side. On the other side, although on a very unstable basis, you see an increased crystallization of what's been dubbed as the quartet of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And in some of the neo-colonial world, particularly the strengthening of the BRICS, which is seen as a certain counterweight to Western imperialism now, particularly in Latin America. India has been vacillating on the Modi between its support for the West and balancing in relation to the position of some of the East. But it's been driven in great part by its dependency now on China economically, which has now surpassed the US as being India's main trading partner. You have, in response to the declarations of Western imperialism, of course, China basically lecturing the US, keep your nose out of Asia. And as they've taken action, there's been conflict and tensions growing, not only in relation to Taiwan, but in relation to the Philippines as well, and other areas, other countries. And although still unstable, you've seen a certain crystallization of the blocks of the countries involved in a bloc around the quartet: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And this clash, comrades, is really dominating the world situation. And the question is, how is it likely to develop in the course of the next period? We have to have a balanced approach towards these developments. But it has moved beyond the level of only economic conflict in relation to economic tariffs. There's more open clashes. In a certain sense, there was a low-intensity warfare beginning to develop, reflected in the cyber attacks which are taking place. A dramatic increase of cyber attacks against Norway, Finland, Poland, Britain. Now that points, comrades, to an increased tendency toward conflict, but it does not mean, because of the class balance of forces, the threat of all-out nuclear war is not posed. That's not the issue at this particular stage. What it does point to is heightened conflicts on a regional basis, many of which, as we see in relation to Gaza and the Ukraine, will include a global element. Now, of course, that is what we've seen as an emphasis in relation to Gaza and Ukraine in the recent period. China has been asserting itself, particularly in Ukraine and particularly recently in terms of the Gaza conflict. And that is a crucial development. The war which is unfolding in Gaza, involving Israel and the Palestinian people, a genocidal war, is already having global consequences. It has intensified in the recent period. The unbelievable horrors of the bombardment of Gaza is incredible. The death toll that is officially reported by the Gaza forces, by Hamas, etc., really does not illustrate the whole picture. I mean, that's the number of dead bodies they counted. There are estimates of up to 200,000 in reality have probably been killed. This, comrades, as we emphasised at the beginning of the conflict, is not simply a repetition of what has happened previously. This is on a far greater scale. What has been unleashed by the Israeli regime is absolutely horrific. You now have the situation, 80% of the Gaza is under evacuation orders. That is in relation to there, and at the same time now, we have the extremely important developments in terms of on the border with Lebanon involving the conflict with Hezbollah. We've raised previously the dangers and the threat that could erupt. In reality, there is already a war being fought on that border. It's a question of the intensity of it. 8,000 missiles fired from Israel into Hezbollah controlled areas. 1,000 roughly from the Lebanon into Israel. Tens of thousands displaced already. And this is increasing incrementally. The drone attack by the Yemen was extremely significant. And yesterday's attack on the Golan Heights has further intensified the crisis. And it raises the prospect of the development of more of an all-out regional war. Not a certainty, neither side maybe wants it, but that is the line of march at this particular stage. And it's bound to have decisive consequences, both in the region, possibly in Iran, but also globally. There's mass opposition to Netanyahu in Israel, it is true, but they have a problem. He still has the majority in the state, and at the moment he's mustered sufficient forces to prevent his removal. The break in the coalition means he's more dependent on the far right. Now that can change, of course, very rapidly, but that is the position that we see at this particular stage. And what's critical, and this is an important point for world relations, because this is an extreme example of where the bourgeois has lost control of its political institutions and sections of the state. You have, in reality, in a sense, a rogue regime in Israel at this stage, which includes fascistic elements in it where the bourgeois are not in control. What's the perspective? We have to be conditional. But it seems the way that they are driving, the horror raining down on the Palestinian people, they're attempting to drive the Palestinian people out of Gaza, probably trying to push it over the border into Egypt through the establishment of camps there. And such is the desperate situation, it's really a miracle. Well, not a miracle, we're Marxists, we don't believe in miracles, but it's incredible that at this stage, it's not happened already, the Palestinians out of desperation are just storming and trying to get over the border. That is on the agenda as something that could develop out of desperation in the next period. The reaction of the Egyptian regime, of course, is another question to that. But it's a measure of how desperate the situation is and how explosive it will become. And that will have repercussions if it takes place on the whole conduct of the struggle in the next period. Now, the intervention of China in the recent period of claiming they secured a deal between Fatah and Hamas represents an important change. Establish a government of national unity after some sort of peace agreement, something which once again brings China directly into collision with Western imperialism and the US. Even if they get a peace deal, what does it mean? The obliteration of Gaza, the attacks on the West Bank that have dramatically increased. I mean, what does it mean in reality? As Tacitus, the Roman historian, puts it, they create a wasteland and they call it peace. And that is one front of this global era of dystopian capitalism. We have, of course, the intensification of the position in the Ukraine, where important changes have taken place. Russia making certain advances in the east. And a significant change is the growing skepticism and even opposition to Zelensky in the Ukraine itself. a skepticism and war weariness hitting Western imperialist powers. How much longer are we going to finance this operation? And again, a very uncertain position in terms of how that how that will continue. And by the way, you can see how the West is perceived to have failed. All of the talk, how they were going to cripple the Russian economy on the basis of sanctions, etc., proved to be worthless in reality because of how they put the Russian economy on a war footing on the one side and what they've done with exports to the likes of India, China and elsewhere with the oil on the other. But crucial to these developments, comrade, is the battle which is currently taking place in the United States. It will shape world events, the outcome of the next presidential election. There is a massive polarization along class lines and along political lines taking place in the US. It's significant at this conjuncture. You've seen the release of this film, Civil War, which depicts an outright, all-out civil war in the US, if comrades have seen the film. And then you thought, well, this is a bit of an exaggeration. And then you see what's happening, you think, well, maybe they've got a point. But the polarization is enormous. Now, of course, the speed with which events are developing globally and the US is unprecedented. The decision of Biden to step down, of course, was a turning point in the situation. And he stepped down, and apologies to the translators, but to quote Shakespeare in his play Macbeth, nothing in his life became him like the leaving of it, which sums up Biden. The best contribution in his life was leaving the political scene. But will the same macabre drama that took place in Shakespeare's Macbeth now take place in the US? We have to see. But nevertheless, it opens up a new situation with Biden's departure. Trump's victory, and this is a point with the economy, despite their claims that the economy is growing in the US, the perception of the US masses is exactly the opposite. Whether it's in recession or not, most people believe there is some form of recession. They're gaining absolutely nothing. Their living standards are falling. And that, combined with other factors, means this polarization is enormous and incredible, though it may seem. It is still possible Trump could win a victory for a second term. It's true, the removal of Biden from the race has boosted the Democrats, and it's made it more difficult for Trump. There's no question about that. But it's still too close to call, in my view, in terms of what the outcome will be. And by the way, I mean, probably the majority of the US ruling class don't want Trump, but a section do. The fact that Musk has swung behind Trump, and some of the high-tech companies as well, is a measure that some have moved in that particular direction. And you can see, and this is a reflection of what has happened internationally with the ideological collapse of the left before Biden stepped down, those most determinedly pressurizing him to stay in the race were Sanders and Cortez from the so-called left of the Democratic Party. And it's an incredible comment on populism, although it seems to have opened up some divisions now, but the appointment of Vance as the vice presidential candidate for Trump is very important. You can see the turmoil in US society. A few years ago, Vance was denouncing Trump as being a Hitler. Now he has gone on an extreme populist rampage, saying he's defending American working people. We've had enough of Wall Street. We've had enough of the big corporations running the country. It will get an important echo amongst sections of the working class, and you can see the confusion which exists. I think if you take, for example, the AFL-CIO, that broadly come out in favour of the Democrats, but then the Teamsters, one of the main unions, under a so-called new left leadership, O'Brien, go and speak to the Republican convention for the first time in 120 years that the Teamsters have had a spokesperson there. And when they approached the Democrats, they didn't even reply to the Teamsters about them speaking there. Now, a Trump victory, comrades, if it happens, and it's far from certain, particularly now, it can change dramatically, should it happen, will completely upend the whole world situation. What's its implication for the war between Russia and Ukraine? You pull the rug and cut down the backing of it. It'll give more of a blank check to Netanyahu in terms of what he is doing. It's going to dramatically destabilize the whole of the world situation. Now, if we take, comrades, these developments in Israel with Netanyahu, this position in relation to Trump and what's happening in the political process in the US and what's happening in some other countries, it poses an important political point for this era. And that is the question of the issue of bourgeois democracy in this period. And there's two issues here that are fundamental. One, what it means for the neo-colonial world, and what it's beginning to mean in the Western imperialist powers. If you take, in the neo-colonial world of Asia, Africa, Latin America, you've had a period of so-called bourgeois democracy in whole swathes of the country. The reality is, Western imperialism and the situation means you have a democratic deficit in these countries. You've had bourgeois democracy on paper, riddled with corruption, economically achieved absolutely nothing, social disintegration, and on the other side, masses looking towards regimes like China, and the perception is progress. The attacks on China, Iran, etc., they're authoritarian, etc., has far less traction than what it did in the past. Even because of the failure of bourgeois democracy, and this is a broad sweep in terms of the neo-colonial world, the failure of it means in swathes there is increased support for the idea of military intervention on the basis it will bring stability and order. Look how they're moving for more repressive measures even where it exists. Pakistan, ban the opposition, PTI, just been banned by the government in collusion, obviously, with the military. The instability of the situation, I mean, what an incredible situation you have with the attempted coup in Bolivia. It appears that the coup was actually initiated and probably put together by the sitting president as a means of garnering opposition, defeat the coup. And what a strange coup. He turns up with a few tanks outside the presidential palace. The president comes out and says, well, I'm the commander-in-chief, end your coup, and he just walks away. Well, it does give credence to Morales' claim that it was a stage-managed event. Even in countries like Nigeria, which I'm sure the comrades will speak about in the discussion, you have such a degree of corruption, such a degree of social turmoil and chaos, particularly triggered by inflationary crises, etc., you can't discount the fact that the military will step in, and maybe with a degree of popularity in order to try and bring stability, at least some sections, amongst some sections of the population. Now, while those are the processes you could see developing in the neo-colonial world, even within the imperialist powers, we see a change in the situation. The old position of bourgeois democracy, which allowed a certain stability, is in the process of fracturing and breaking down. It's been eroded, as we see in France, Germany, the US, as elements of dysfunctionality. It's a reflection, particularly, of the collapse and disintegration of the traditional parties. It means it's not providing the same stable outlet for capitalism that it had in the past. And one of the reactions, it's also fear of the movement, but one of the responses of the bourgeois to that is an increased tendency towards more repressive features, more features of Bonapartism in terms of the rule, even in Europe, etc. Now, comrades, these are features of this era of capitalism. But as we've identified, there is another side to the process. Comrades should cast their minds back. A number of years ago, we raised the issue of a perspective of a series of multiple uprisings being triggered by the social and economic conditions that the masses face. The list is incredible in terms of mass social upheavals and uprisings, to the point almost of revolution. Ecuador, Chile, Sri Lanka, Sudan, Lebanon. It can go on and on in terms of the list. More recently, Kenya. Now you have to say Bangladesh in the same position. Incredible determination and how the movement is driven forward. And by the way, a feature in all of these mass movements, particularly the younger generation, has been the loss of fear of the state apparatus. Consciousness developed. Chile, as the comrades was reported, we had the slogan, it's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years of neoliberalism. Look at Bangladesh, the statements. The protests start, quite a confused issue, it's a bit complicated, but that's a separate discussion. But nevertheless, the protests that start, the repression is absolutely brutal. And what's the response? To quote some of the student leaders, this is not a protest, it's war. Becomes hardened. And reflecting how these societies are developed, it's got a certain high-tech element to it as well, in terms of cyber attacks on the government buildings in Bangladesh, etc. It shows, and all of these mass movements have demonstrated an enormous hunger, a thirst for change, to end the rottenness of the system. And this is a feature of the era, and it demonstrates above all else the revolutionary potential of the mass movement once it begins to develop. And that, of course, comrades, should be an enormous sense of inspiration and optimism for us in terms of what the future holds. But it also obligates us, comrades, as Marxists, as the general staff of a small revolutionary party, to be brutally realistic, to see the potential involved in these movements, but also the difficulties and the obstacles that still remain to be overcome. All of them contain enormously positive features, but they also had important weaknesses which acted as an obstacle and held them back. And our task is to understand those, because failure to do so means that we'll not grasp the character of this era and the tasks that face the working class and its advanced layer and us as revolutionary Trotskyists. You saw an outpouring of rage and anger in all of them, a consciousness against the system, against corruption, against the elite. But it was not to the point of the idea of an alternative social system, of socialism in particular. All of them had certain forms of organisation, but fundamentally it lacked serious organisation. There was no party there. There was a certain anti-party mood present in all of these movements in varying degrees and varying forms. And it partly reflected the consciousness, the limitations on it, but also elements of the class character of some of these movements. In the sense that the organised working class as a class was not consciously organised and at the head of these movements and driving them forward with the idea of an alternative social system. And inevitably, in that situation, they all stagnated, hit a wall. Some, like in Sudan, went into terrible features of counter-revolution and breakdown. In Sri Lanka, which is crucial for us with our forces that we have there, we see the continuation of the old regime, the possibility of the JVP coming to power. But an important point for us to emphasise is that this is not the end of the process. Because in all of these situations, all of the underlying conditions and features which existed, which provoked these mass movements, continue. And it means inevitably they will be repeated and new waves of struggle will develop. However, unfortunately, in some countries, because of the depth of the economic and social crisis, prior to that developing, they can also fall into despair, disintegration, breakup of nations, as we're seeing take place in some countries. But it's important, comrades, here to see a crucial question is the issue of political consciousness, of how it develops. It's in the process of recovery and development during the course of these movements, took advances and steps forward, but was above all shaped by the lingering effects of the collapse of Stalinism, politically, ideologically, and organisationally. And the political consciousness, of course, does not advance in a straight line. In Chile, for example, it took a massive leap forward in the course of 2019. Was not back to the level that we saw in 1970-73 or even in the 1980s, but it took a step forward. Now, because the movement ran into the sand and ran into a defeat, the consciousness has gone back. And in the opinion polls, the right have the upper hand. It's a process, and it could change again back in the other direction. But of course, the underlying crisis in the neo-colonial world is catastrophic. And it's reflected in a number of countries of a certain social disintegration. I don't know if comrades saw the report of what's going on in Brazil, even under Lula's government. You have in Rio an explosion of the Pentecostal churches. Desperation there. But it's now changed a little bit, because that's been there for a while, the explosion of the Pentecostal churches. The Pentecostal groupings now in Rio, in the favelas, have included what they call narco-Pentecostalists as well. They're involved in the drug trafficking, etc. They're going attacking Catholic churches. I mean, it's an incredible degree of a certain social disintegration and collapse of the bourgeois state. They don't control swathes of the area. The same could be true of Mexico and some other countries. Into this, the military and other forces can intervene. The vacuum has meant, for example, in Argentina, you saw the coming to power of Milei, which in reality is a desperate cry of desperation for the masses, with an incredible collapse of living standards which had taken place there. But there is a paradox here, because Milei has been so catastrophic, and the figures are eye-watering as the comrades look at what's happened. Milei's been in power since January. Unemployment has gone up something like 400,000 in the space of a few months. The numbers of living below the poverty line have gone over 50%. Dramatic increase, but in the space of a few months. It's incredible what has taken place. Argentina historically had a relatively high standard of living. It's already provoked a general strike in Argentina, But interestingly enough, in Chile, where the far right were ahead in the opinion polls, a lot of Chileans have now looked over the borders of Argentina and they thought, no, we don't want to go down that road. And the support for the far right has partly gone down as a consequence of what happened in Argentina. Now, comrades, it's important we see these mass uprisings as a reflection of the era that we're in. But they've been accompanied, of course, by important features of a resurgence of the class struggle in important countries of the imperialist West. We'll discuss in Europe, of course, those processes, how the strikes in Britain, Germany, Austria, some other countries, what has taken place in the US, which is extremely significant in terms of the early stages of a revival of the class struggle, both of which should imbue us with confidence as to what is coming in the course of the next period. These are not completed processes. These are the first waves. The mass uprisings, this revival of the class struggle is the first consequences of the era that we are now in. Greater events are impending and will develop in the course of the next period. But we do have, comrades, this period at this stage of a global political vacuum which exists. The absence of mass workers' parties, reflecting the era of and how the consciousness of socialism was thrown back, is weighing down on the situation. And in reality, ideologically in this period, we are in an era of populism. Populism of the right, populism of the left. And at the left, it takes the form of not speaking of the working class. This is a political. We speak of the people. We speak of citizens. We speak of assemblies. This is the terminology of Mélenchon. It's a terminology largely of Corbyn. It's a terminology of most of the left globally at this stage. And it reflects something. There's an echo there of the sort of terminology that you saw in the bourgeois revolutions in the 19th century. We see Mélenchon in France as a point for Europe. Mélenchon, because it's France, ideologically, they put it much clearer, and he spells it out. We don't want a party, because that means working class. And we're in the era of the people. So we have a movement. We don't have a party. And that really is being echoed by Corbyn in Britain, and it's echoed most certainly in the US, where they just remain wedded to the Democrats, and many other countries as well. And it's incredible in this situation, when you look at the official left as it exists, as this crisis has deepened, they've become more and more compromising in terms of the position they put forward. The second pink wave we've had in Latin America is weaker, despite the crisis being greater than the first pink wave. There's no Chavez speaking about socialism at the moment. But it's important, comrades, when we see the populism of the right, when they come to power filling this vacuum, that we emphasize the limitations. Milei is already a regime in crisis. Bolsonaro was defeated in terms of Brazil and provoked a backlash. It has taken a lot longer. Modi in India in the last election suffered an important setback and defeat as well. But it's important to emphasize, comrades, that we see the limitations of these right regimes. It doesn't detract from the seriousness of what they represent of coming to power, of right-wing populism, the brutality of the measures that they take, including in India, including in Brazil, around Bolsonaro, and some of the countries, they have fascistic groupings around them. It's not mass fascism as it was in the past, but there are fascistic groupings that are unleashed and are let off the leash once these regimes are in power. And it has important implications. And it poses one issue that arises from this, particularly in Europe and internationally indeed as well, is the effect of the economic and the climatic crisis is having on migration. The migration issue is obviously already crucial, and it's going to intensify with the horrors that are developing in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And it means us and the working class developing a program and a combative response of how to deal with this issue to head off the far right who will capitalize it is of critical importance. And this is now affecting not just Europe, there's a discussion partly from Europe on that, it's global, the implications of this. It's developing in Africa with the migration from one country to another. It is incredible, having had experience there, to see what has happened in Latin America with the migrations of Peruvians, and in particular the migrations of Venezuelans, and how it has stimulated the far right and racism in those countries, like Chile. And it's collapsed. And by the way, this is a point, what is happening now in Venezuela, probably less so here in Europe, Latin America, maybe America, is going to be used as a club. The elections today in Venezuela, we will see, it is a club to be used by the right against the issue of socialism. 7.7 million have fled the country. It's devastating. And by the way, comrades, let's go back some years. We warned about this. While others were cheerleading Chavez and the process there, we were warning about these developments. It's taken some time, but it's hit now. And by the way, the catastrophe that's there, in the last 2 years, I was shocked to see the figures. It's a consequence of the embargo, but 1 in 10 of the Cuban population have left the country in the last 2 years. That'll be mainly the youth. And therefore, this issue, comrades, is crucial that we come to grips with it in our propaganda. How we prepare for it has got its own particular form, but it's a global issue that the working class and the movement needs to deal with in its programme and in terms of its action in the course of the next period. Now, comrades, having said all of this, we also must emphasise the effect that all this is having on a significant layer. There is a burning hatred and anger amongst big sections of the younger generation in particular, on all continents, as a consequence of war, as a consequence of the environmental catastrophe, as a consequences of the polarization economically and socially which is taking place. The attempted assassination of Trump was partly a reflection of the era that we're in. It wasn't incidental. By the way, when Biden says it's a wholly un-American act, he's wrong on that. It's a very American act, the assassination of President. but it's a warning of what is coming. What has happened in France last week on the railways is a further warning. Out of desperations on the eco issue, on other issues as well, you can see layers of the youth, particularly where the working class is not organised and developing as an organised alternative, out of desperation, can take up the arms. Elements of individual terrorism, elements of direct action will be taken up in the next period, and we have to be prepared for that. It can include, as we've seen, a rioting and outbursts of anger, but it can go further than that in the course of the next period amongst sections. And it's important, comrades, we as an international, not in an ultra-left manner, in a balanced way, reach out to that layer of youth who are looking in a more radical, combative way to struggle against the system. Not to pander to their wrong methods, not to sow illusions in them, but we have to articulate that we stand as a revolutionary organisation for a revolutionary change of society, and of course then flow from that, explain what we mean by that and the actions that's necessary to achieve that. And linked to it in the neo-colonial world, it's why we have it as a commission at this school. We have to be prepared to look towards dealing with an issue that we've not had to grapple with for a number of years in a neo-colonial world I'm talking about here, and that is the re-emergence of different forms of guerrilla struggle. And Myanmar, what has taken place there is very significant. The military faced the possibility of defeat. Now, the ideological base of some of these guerrilla movements that develop, as we see in Myanmar, will not be like the 1970s when it was on us broadly, under the socialist umbrella, broadly speaking. It'd be more complicated than that. But nevertheless, as an issue, may take more of a form of nationalism, ethnic content, etc. We have to be prepared to deal with it politically, especially in the neo-colonial world. And linked with that, in all areas of the world, as we feature in this school as well, is the critical importance of the national question, which during the course of these geopolitical conflicts and what is developing is re-emerging as a crucial question. And therefore, comrades, we have to come back. The issue that we are confronted with here today is not if capitalism is in crisis, it's not if capitalism is in a dead end. It is clearly in a dead end as a social system. The issue that the working class and ourselves need to deal with, of course, is the issue of the political consciousness of how that would develop in the course of struggle, the crucial role of the intervention of revolutionary socialist organisations like ourselves in assisting the development of political consciousness where possible, and in that sense of the working class itself preparing to rebuild its organisations politically, ideologically, and also organisationally as a means of facing up to what this era of dystopian capitalism means in reality. We have big opportunities, therefore, comrades, in front of us, but it means we have to be imbued with a clear understanding of the character of the era and the task that's before us. of how we reach out to reach and convince the most combative sections of youth and workers of the issue of socialism and of the issue of revolutionary socialism. In a skillful, transitional manner, yes, but nevertheless in a very audacious manner as well. If we do that, and on the basis of us preparing ourselves politically, ideologically as well, we will accomplish those tasks, strengthen our forces, which can play a crucial role in the issue of rebuilding the workers' movement. We're faced with many tasks. There's an element here of what the Marxists face in the era of the First International and before, ideologically. We're dealing with different elements of the tasks of the issue of the workers' movement as well itself. And in that sense, we have an historic responsibility to rebuild support for the issues of Marxism, for the issues of socialism, against the background of the era of populism and political fragmentation, which is happening even on the left. And the only way we'll be able to achieve that is if we have clear political and theoretical and programmatical understanding and audacious combative intervention into the struggles which develop. We live in a convulsive period. It's the death agony of capitalism, as we said. And as Gramsci put it, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And there are many monsters out there. But it's also the time for us to have seen a glimpse of what the future brings as well. And that should imbue us with confidence in terms of what is also coming down the track as this system decays. It should imbue us with confidence of what we can build and what the working class internationally can achieve in the course of the next period as part of a global struggle to defeat dystopian capitalism and replace it with a global socialist order. Thank you. Thank you, comrades.